Before we make our conclusions, I want to pick up on something mentioned last time concerning the final motif of the final episode of Mark's Gospel account, verses 9 to 20 of chapter 16. Last time we simply mentioned that many today reject these final 12 verses of Mark that are nevertheless original and belong in Mark's Gospel account. So, the false charge against these final verses are that in the 19th century, the so-called higher critics began to claim that the final 12 verses of Mark are unoriginal, having been added after the fact. And their basis for that false claim is two manuscripts, Codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, both purportedly dating as early as the 4th century AD, that lack these 12 verses. However, it's not difficult to show that despite these verses' absence from those two manuscripts, there's abundant earlier evidence of these 12 verses being present in Mark's account and therefore being original. In fact, those two supposedly early manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, are not actually early at all. That's been demonstrated by the great Bill Cooper in his book Forging Sinaiticus, where Cooper demonstrates that those manuscripts were tampered with by a forger. Constantine von Tischendorf purportedly discovered Sinaiticus and advocated for Vaticanus to be included in the text of the New Testament. Yet, Tischendorf himself asserted that one and the same scribe clearly omitted the last 12 verses from both of these codices in his work Vaticanum, and Harris observes this too in Stichometry. So, how is it these two manuscripts were handled by the same scribe, and it was the same scribe that omitted the final 12 verses from both? Tischendorf showed his hand there. In any case, as to that, though there's abundant evidence that the final 12 verses of Mark were there long before Sinaiticus and Vaticanus ever showed up, even if those two manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinai, are from the 4th century, there's abundant evidence of the 12 verses being there before the 4th century. And it's principally found in allusions to and quotations of those very 12 verses in Mark in the writings of the early church fathers, the ante-Nicene or pre-4th century Christian writers. The great John Bergen identified 19 of these quotations or allusions of the final 12 verses, and I note 4 of them only here, as you see on the slide, which all predate that supposed early date of Sinai and Vatican, which, as I say, is doubtful, in fact, demonstrated as false anyways. So let's just look at these 4 examples. So first, Papias of Hierapolis alludes to Mark 16 verse 18. The clause is that when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. Eusebius records that Papias heard from the daughters of Apostle Philip of this apostolic sign gift occurring for an apostle, not one of the 12, but one named in Acts 1 verse 23, Joseph Barsabas Justus. He was shortlisted as one of 2 disciples considered to replace Judas Iscariot as the 12th apostle. Matthias was chosen instead, as you no doubt have read from the book of Acts. But Papias' description of the event is that after drinking noxious poison through the Lord's grace, this Justus Barsabas Joseph experienced no evil consequence. Papias lived and wrote about AD 100. His years are AD 60 to 130. So it's over 200 years before the supposed early date of Vatican and Sinai. How could Papias allude to a verse that didn't exist? It doesn't, without Mark 16 verse 18, which Papias alludes to, the promise from the Lord Jesus of this miraculous authority to be able to drink deadly poison and yet be unharmed would have no textual basis. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the New Testament. So Papias clearly alludes to Mark 16 verse 18, that this sign gift is just one of many confirmations of the gospel of the kingdom preached by the apostles. Secondly, Justin Martyr of Neapolis, or Nablus, quotes Mark 16 verse 20. When discussing the Lord Jesus' ascension and the actions of the apostles afterwards, Justin Martyr writes the clause, Exalthantes Pantachua Kerixin, having moved out they preached everywhere, and this clause is a direct quotation of 16 verse 20. It doesn't occur anywhere else in the New Testament, like Papias' allusion. Justin Martyr could only have read it here in Mark 16 verse 20, and he wrote his first apology in AD 151. 200 years before the supposed early dates of Vatican and Sinai. How could Justin Martyr quote from this verse if it didn't exist when he quoted from it? Third example, Irenaeus of Lyon quotes and discusses Mark 16 verse 19, and Irenaeus, as you see, was writing around AD 180. He writes, "So then after the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sits on the right hand of God." The final two clauses of this verse occur with his very wording, barring the addition of Jesus and the tense of sits instead of sat, only in Mark 16 verse 19, and altogether they occur only in Mark 16 verse 19. Irenaeus' quotation of Mark 16 verse 19 occurred over 100 years before the supposed early dates of Vatican and Sinai were purportedly copied. So once again, if Mark 16 9-20 is not original and didn't exist, how could Irenaeus have quoted from it? Fourthly and finally here, Hippolytus of Portus quotes Mark 16 17-18 as recorded in the Apostolic Constitutions. He says, "Now these signs shall follow them that have believed in my name. They shall cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall by no means hurt them. They shall lay their hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Hippolytus is a contemporary of Irenaeus, writing about AD 190. So once again we ask, how could he have quoted Mark 16 17-18 if it's not original and so didn't exist at the time? In light of this evidence, which is only a sampling, how can it be claimed that the absence of Mark 16 9-20 from the much later manuscripts, Codices Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, cause us to view these 12 verses as inauthentic? That would be an irrational and baseless claim, a rational and baseless thing to think. Clearly.